in the morning, beneath the stars so bright. Pull your hat down, make sure your cinch is tight. Horses kinda snuffy, cold chill up your spine. You'll get your ass moving, son, we're burning daylight.
Howdy there, I'm Matt McKinley and we're burning daylight.
In the saddle till the job's done right.
Welcome to Burnin' Daylight, the only podcast for the working cowboy.
Well, welcome back, Daylight Burners. It's been a minute since I did an episode on the history of the meat packing industry. I've been doing a lot of reading, a lot of research, and I've learned a lot. I've learned a whole lot, but I wasn't real for sure how to continue this because there's a lot of moving parts, and a lot of it has to do with the time period, and it's all kind of linked into the history of America, in particular, like the Gilded Age, the robber barons, the westward expansion, the rise of the labor movement, and it all ties in with the meatpacking industry. It's a unique industry in and of its own, but at the same time, it falls into the same wild ups and downs of the American economy. And it's just, you kind of have to zoom out and look at, like, it just, like, you have to follow your rabbit holes from like a 30,000 foot view. It's like you're looking at an ant farm. You go down here and you read about this, and then, well, now you got to backtrack and because you got some ideas and you learn something else about this, and you're like, oh shit, all right. So, like, in particular, I read the biography of Gustavus Franklin Swift, the founder of Swift and Company. Really interesting fellow. And one of the things I found very hard is actually finding detailed accounts of some of these, in particular, the big three meatpacking giants of the Gilded Age. So it was Swift and Company, Gustavus Swift, Armour and Company, that was Philip Armour, and then Morris and Company, that was Nelson Morris. Together they formed what was called the Beef Trust, and they essentially became the monopoly of the meatpacking industry. You could say there were three. They're not a true monopoly because there was three competitors, but in fact they formed their own company as a. I guess there was four players in that, but it was the big three, and then Cudahy, I think is how you pronounce it. It's like Cudahy. But they were all. It's kind of like these big dairies. You know, they're all related to each other. They're these giant corporations, but also family farms. And it's like all the dairies out in Kansas started in California, and they're all intermarried, and it's like that's all like one giant family. It seems like with the dairies, and it seems like that way with the meatpacking industry too. Maybe they're not all married, but it's all like the same few families that started off. And Cudahy was he was either related to Armour or Morris. I can't remember. It's not super relevant for this episode, but it's a lot like say the oil industry, the iron industry, the banking industry. It's they all follow kind of the same path as the American economy switches from a mercantilist system, which is kind of what the Civil War was ultimately fought over was a system of free trade versus mercantilism, which is what the South essentially had. And it's and then that's a whole different conversation. The more I read about mercantilism, I'm not sure if we ever got off that system. Just tweaked it a little bit, it seems like. But that's a discussion for a different day with maybe with an actual economist that can talk through that stuff more coherently than myself. And I'm trying to, like, it's been a struggle trying to make this coherent, telling you guys this story, because it's a lot more complex of a story than I ever initially imagined. It's one thing to look up an outlaw and put together in a couple hours, a pretty decent, compelling podcast story to tell y'all. But something like this, where, I mean, there's just so much to it that you got to read books upon books upon books, and sometimes you're reading about something that doesn't even mention the meatpacking industry once, but it in a roundabout way, it all ties together, and it's so bear with me, and I'll try to help make sense of it. And we're gonna focus on Chicago and the big three, because that's, while there's other major markets and packing hubs throughout the country, Chicago is where it really all blew up. And so I called this episode Animal Meets Machine. And in Chicago, I mean, Cincinnati to a lesser extent, but Chicago's really where the Industrial Revolution, hit head on with animal agriculture. And Chicago was a hub for not just packing, but I mean, it was fucking booming. I mean, it was industry of all kinds. There was huge agricultural implement companies there, like McCormick and I think it was International Harvester at the time. But anyway, all those old farm companies, a lot of them originated in Chicago because they had a booming iron and steel industry. They were a major lumber supplier. All the forests around the Great Lakes, all that lumber came into Chicago and either got milled or just sent out west for the settlers out there or wherever. I mean, it was a hub for just about everything, textiles, you name it. It was a bustling city, and the meatpacking industry was a big part of it, and in particular because it had its own little area, Packentown. And but if you'll if you remember the episode with Dominic Pasigan, he talks about the different neighborhoods of Chicago, and Packentown had their own, had neighborhoods within that that square mile. But all throughout Chicago, it's different neighborhoods. And so, like, if you're in this neighborhood, you may, you had the packing workers, and you had like the steel workers, you had the textiles. Printing was a huge industry as well. A bunch of the books throughout that period were printed there in Chicago, and being a major transportation hub, that it made sense that the Chicago grew as fast as it did. But Chicago really made its bones, or started making its bones, pre-Civil War or during the Civil War, in the packing industry, just shipping meat to the troops. And when the war ended, there was a lot of people coming to Chicago, a lot of big money and a lot of poor workers, immigrants, Southerners that are suddenly without a home, and freed blacks, all, you name it. People are flooding in to Chicago, and there's a demand for meat. Like there's just waves after waves of immigrants coming in. It's really it's really funny how many similarities there are to today. I mean, I think, and I don't know I don't know how to take these statistics, but what I heard was somewhere in the neighborhood of 3 million illegal immigrants come in under Joe Biden's term. I don't know what the number was under Trump, but when you look back through history, like the borders have always been pretty soft. You know, like we've always had these waves of immigration, and then every now and then they'll be like, "All right, that's enough," and they'll shut it down as much as they can, and then it's a good place to live, you know. So, but anyway, with all this demand for meat, and then with the beef boom out west, like that'll be a whole nother episode of the ranching aspect of it. But as you can see, like there's just so many interlocking parts that you got to unpack to really understand like the the whole kit and caboodle of the meatpacking industry. I mean, you got to look at the way that the currency was at the time, interest rates and all, and then it gets really complex and kind of wonky, but it's important, and because it all ties in. And one of the big takeaways I got from this book, and so it was written by Lewis F. Swift, which is the son of Gustavus Swift. One, this guy clearly had OCD. Clearly was a high functioning OCD or somewhere on the spectrum of autism. Like he was definitely on it. But also, much like some of these big time farmers that you see that are always they always got brand new tractors and implements, and they're always driving a new pickup, and you think, man, they must be rolling in money. And then like you could peel back the layer of that of their books, and you realize like they're just heavily leveraged. You know, the bank owns everything for the most part, and that was the way it was for not just these meatpacking companies, but just like the railroad companies, which was very intertwined with the meatpacking industry, particularly even before the advent of the refrigerated car. We will get into that here in a minute, because Gustavus Swift played a huge role in that, and it is as slimy as some of the tactics these guys used. Also, like the sheer brilliance and guts, and just like, I'm gonna find a way to get hanging beef sent to New York City from Chicago. One way or the other, we're gonna get it done, and we're gonna make it work. And then the tactics they use to box out the local butchers, and it is cutthroat tactics, but it's still really impressive from a business standpoint. And a lot of it dealt with technology, and a lot of the unrest and the anger towards these companies had to do with technology, because as technology improved, the easier the job, maybe not easier, but the less you had to train your workers, because you could, as the assembly line got more complex and machinery got involved, you were able to narrow the tasks of your worker down to one or two simple little movements, and they just did that same thing all day, every day. And because of that efficiency, it drove down wages, and it helped in a big part lead to the huge labor unrest and the union movements throughout the late 1800s. But to I guess to wrap all that little introduction up, due to all the conditions, the mass wave of immigrants, the migration within the country itself from east to west, and the advent of the railroad, uh, really drove this huge. And then the wild, the cattle that were allowed to just run wild during the Civil War in Texas in particular led to this huge supply as well as a huge demand for fresh meat. And there was a lot of kinks to be worked out along the way, but things moved really, really fast. And the three guys that were able to stay out ahead of the market and kind of corner their little segment ended up being Philip Armour, Gustavus Swift, and Nelson Morris. All right, so I'm going to focus pretty heavily on Gustavus Swift because the other two I've not been able to read like a full biography on. Just been some like research papers and stuff. But like I said, they're really hard to. It's really hard to find some like detailed accounts of these people, but reading this, and then I've read so it's like The Dark Side of the Beef Trust, and that was by Herman Hirschauer. He was a butcher, worked for some of these one. I think it was Morris. I can't remember who he worked for. And then Early to Bed, Early to Rise, 20 Years in Hell with a Beef Trust, Roger Scheel. Not real fun reading. It's interesting when I sit back and look at it, but it's still not, it wasn't much fun to read. And one thing I've come to find out is at the end of the day, it all comes down to money. And these three guys, particularly Gustavus Swift, they knew how finance and money worked. They knew Gustavus Swift was one of the I'd have to look back before then, but I would have to say he's one of the OG Too Big to Fail, and it wasn't so much from a government perspective, but from a banking perspective. During this period of the rapid growth, so into the war of the Civil Wars, 1865, and we'll say roll it into beginning the start of World War I, so like 1914. In that roughly 50-year period, there was so much happened here in the United States that for the most part, we aside from the Indian Wars and then a little Spanish American escapade that we did, it was a relative time of peace. Huge expansion and a lot of fuckery went on with the currency as well, and it had a lot to do with overseas banks, and it's funny how even back then how interconnected the world was. I mean, the world's a big place, and it's got a lot smaller, particularly today. But even back then, events all the way over in Europe had a huge ripple effect on the American economy. And the Packers were no stranger to that as well. With the panics of 1873 and 1893. In 1873, Sherman signed, what was that act called? That's 1873, 1893. I mean, the U.S. government had to be bailed out by a syndicate of American banks, and then the Rothschild Bank over in Europe, or over in England. Let's see, the Sherman Silver Purchase Act. So that was 1890, I guess. Okay, so before the Sherman Silver Act, there was we were on a gold and silver standard. So the U.S. government would buy silver to be minted into coins. A lot of other governments would. I think Germany in particular kind of started the trend of being on a gold, solely a gold standard for their currency. And in the West, particularly Nevada and California, there's Montana as well, I guess. Huge silver mines. I mean, it was boomtown in the West. You had cattle, you had farming, you had mining, real estate speculation, you had the railroads. I mean, there was big money to be made. The problem was we didn't have a very stable currency, and a lot of it had to do with the influx of silver into the system. And I believe Sherman did something where the government would only buy a certain amount. And then in 1890, with the Sherman Silver Purchase Act, it required the government to buy okay. All right, so the 78 Bland-Allison Act required the government to buy a certain amount, and then the Sherman Silver Purchase Act required them to buy even more, which diluted the currency because the more silver was traditionally is not considered as valuable as gold. So the influx of silver drove the overall worth of the dollar down, inflated the currency, kind of like what we have today. And this all led to speculation, cheap credit. And in 1873 and 1893, both, there was a big run on the banks, stock markets collapsed. And I believe in 1873, the New York Stock Exchange shut down for like 10 days. Can't imagine them doing that nowadays, but I mean, I guess maybe it's possible. I don't know. It led to the rise of a huge populist movement throughout the Midwest and the West. It was kind of similar to what you see today. It was mining interest and farming interest and kind of a big backlash against wealthy elites and huge corporations. Once again, kind of like you see today. And with all these crashes and panics and depressions that followed after the panic, both of them lasted about 4 years. It looked like, and we're talking, like New York with 25% unemployment. I think they said Michigan had somewhere around 40% unemployment. And Illinois had to been the same way with and it led to to huge wage cuts, huge layoffs, and a lot of turmoil. And like I said, the packing industry was right there in the thick of it. When you look at the Haymarket riot, I forget what year that was, 1891 maybe. But that was all started with a railroad strike. and led to huge violence. And the Packers, like I said, were right in the thick of that as well, because a lot of that had to do with the Union stockyards, which supplied the Packers with live animals and exported their product back east and to the West Coast and wherever else it was going. Gustavus Swift, he really is kind of the definition of a rags to riches type of deal, and just a hard scrabble, pinch a penny wherever you can. He can squeeze a penny so hard you'd make him cough or whatever. Who is on a penny? Is that Lincoln? Lincoln's on a nickel, right? Washington's on a penny. Either way, he was a tight ass, to put it plainly. And he started with $30 that he borrowed from his dad, bought a heifer, butchered it, and sold it in a cart. That's how he got his start, and was pretty successful early on. Moved to Chicago, bought a packing house for $30,000, and the race was on. He employed these new methods. I think Philip Armour with Armour and Company was the man to be credited with the disassembly line, and which was later recoined the assembly line for automobile workers. But he's the one that kind of implemented the conveyor belt system in the packing industry. Gustavus Swift was the one who helped develop the refrigerated rail car, and this was a huge development, but it was like pulling teeth trying to get them on the tracks, because the railroads had no incentive to ship swinging beef back to the east. They didn't know if there was a market for it, and they made buku money sending live cattle and hogs back east to the packing plants out there. So they just said, no, we're not doing it. And they Swift and Company eventually ended up buying their own. They bought and developed their own refrigerated rail cars, but they still had no trains that would pull them. So they eventually made a deal with a Canadian railroad, and they took what you might call the scenic route, and they went up into Canada, over to the east, and then dropped down into New York City in the eastern seaboard. And from there, then they had to establish a market, and what they were able to do, because they had one of the genius things about Gustavus Swift, as I mentioned before, one of the early too big to fail companies, is he said there wasn't a bank east of Ohio. Maybe that was actually, I think that was from Roger Scheel. He said there wasn't a bank east of Ohio and north of Virginia that he didn't have a note in. So he'd borrowed money from bank after bank after bank, and if he couldn't get any money here, he'd go to a different one. And it was kind of the same story with Gustavus Swift. Like he extended himself out as far as he could, and then when he couldn't go any farther, he'd just go find another bank, and then he'd run credit with them as far as he could. And it was always about expanding, making it bigger, investing in new technologies, or setting up new plants, setting up new ice house, because they had to have ice houses all along the railroads, because eventually the railroads are like, all right, fine, we're gonna make money off of this too. And there was backroom wheeling and dealing as there always were, and they fixed the rates for the packing guys, but then they would inflate the rates for the cattle on the hoof, and they pass the cost of it back on to the producers, and all of it led to this constant butting of heads between the rancher, eventually the feedlot guy, but the rancher, the farmer, and then the packing houses, the railroads and the packing houses, that where whatever profit they might get on their cattle, it was huge chunk out for yardage and and transport, and then you're bidding against a rig system there at that point. You're essentially just accepting what you can get, because these guys at the top, the four big packers, they control the market. They've got their thumb on the scale, and it was 100% true. It all came out in court proceedings, and and eventually led to huge regulatory laws being passed on their industry in particular. There was a lot of antitrust busting going on and during that point in time, but the meatpacking industry got leaned on pretty hard. I mean, like, specific bills and agencies created to regulate them. I mean, there were other industries that got that as well, but meatpacking in particular, they really got leaned on hard. But all the events leading up to that are fascinating in and of itself. I mean, you had the invention of this machine that would strip the hide off of a hog, that would essentially beat all the bristles off, so that where normally it'd take a crew of like 3 or 4 guys, quite a little bit of time to get the hide scraped clean, where now you run it through this machine and it beats most of the bristles off, where your crew scraping the hide doesn't have to take hardly any time to get it done, and they're able to move animals through faster and faster and faster. They got this continually moving chain, because these guys are all so leveraged out the ass, expanding their empire, that everything has to be done on efficiency, and so if the chain stops moving for any amount of time, they're losing money, because they got to have so much product out the door in order to meet their margins and eventually pay back their their investors. And it's it kind of reminds me of like the Wolf of Wall Street type deal, where everybody's just like, more, and it truly is kind of the picture of unbridled capitalism, where it's all about profit and production, and get it out the door as fast as you can, and get me another load of cattle in here as soon as possible. And you better knock that steer on the first whack, so we can, because if not, then it slows the entire process down, and you're going to lose your job, and you're already leveraged out the ass, because you want a little piece of the pie, so you went out and bought a house on 20% interest or whatever, and you miss one payment and they throw you out in the cold. You lose all that money, all the equity that you put into this little piece of shit house, and you don't even hardly speak the language, but you're big and strong as an ox, and you're willing to give it a go. So you just keep slogging away at it, and then big hiccup in the economy, and there's a big run on the banks, and now all these loans are getting called, and now, so your boss is like, you got to work faster, and also we're going to pay you less because we can't afford it now. And by the way, your crew of 6 is now a crew of 4 because, well, we can't afford to pay those other 2, and you better figure out how to get it done if you want to keep your job, because guess what? There's 2 people that I fired this morning from your crew that, boy, they'll be looking for a job, and if you can't do it, I'll hire them right back, and you'll be out on the street. And it's a rat race, and all the while they're inventing new machines that is taking the job of somebody else, and yeah, it was a messy time for all the accomplishments and all the glory that built, this enormous economy that we have here in America. It was a ugly process getting there. Those early days of just building a massive economy out of a vast wilderness is you're gonna break a few eggs to make that omelet for sure. And it was kind of just par for the course. It was you can go from any sector of the economy, and it was pretty much the same, whether it was textiles or railroad or mining. Mining in particular, it was oftentimes brutal work and long days, and the you were pretty much owned by the company that you worked for, and that company was pretty much owned by a series of different banks that couldn't default on. They couldn't, they couldn't, let him go and let him fail because they had too much money tied up in him. So they had to just keep floating him credit to keep going, and he had to keep pushing the people as hard as they could, so that he could he could just keep afloat himself. So it was all kind of a house of cards, but it was I guess built on a solid foundation. And then the higher up, the bigger the company got, the more flimsy it became. And but also, like, the harder the heads of these huge organizations, the harder they worked to keep a grip on power, because if they lost any market share, they could be gone the next day. It was the way technology was moving. It was incredibly easy compared to what it was before to start up a huge empire like this. But it was also like you had to just have an iron grip on the market in order to stay at the top, and that's what they did. And the more I read about these big three, they really just played off of one another. I mean, it was incredible how just interconnected they borrowed ideas from each other. They consulted with each other. They fixed prices, and they really turned America into kind of the grocery store of the world. They were the meat market of the world for a long time. Still kind of are. And it was a really cutthroat, brutal process to get there. But in the process of getting there, we've really kind of streamlined how to feed a large quantity of people, beef in particular, because it just takes a long time from start to finish to put a hamburger or steak on a plate. And it was it was the speed and the technology and the increase in efficiency at the kill floor that allowed for a boom in the ranching sector. It caused huge amounts of competition and innovation within the ranching industry, introducing different breeds and different methods of handling. And it was all a very symbiotic relationship. But it was always kind of clear who had the upper hand, like who was the host in that whole deal. And it was the Packers. They've always had the upper hand. And I don't know how that all ever changes. I think maybe that's always going to be the case. But it was, it's kind of from day one with these big packing companies. It was, it was a dance with the devil. They treated you real nice and then they'd fuck you real hard. And it's kind of fascinating just to watch how it all played out. And like with it all, I mean, it's hard not to admire these guys because they really what they helped build is something truly remarkable. When you look at the Union stockyards in Chicago and the sheer amount of animals that got shuffled through there in a year, that was like 1921 was the height of it, and how many millions of head came through there every year, and the amount of people that were involved in getting that all, from hoof to table. It was it's an incredibly complex process, and it takes somebody with a lot of grit and determination and a lot of imagination too to get it done. And for all their faults, I gotta hang, tip of the hat to those fellows, because they really changed the world in this, at the time, frontier town of Chicago. And they created a monster that I don't think they realized what they created at the time. They were just they were looking to be the biggest and the best, and they accomplished that. But it's it's a terrible beast when you get down to the nitty gritty of what the packing industry is. And it's been pretty evident for a while who has, like I said, in a very symbiotic relationship between producer and packer. It's very clear for a long time who's had the upper hand, who was the host, and who was just the parasite hanging on for scraps. And I don't say that saying that to talk down to the ranchers. It just the analogy, like we're just essentially begging for scraps, and we're just kind of a nuisance to them that they put up with. As soon as they can get rid of them, and they, you see a big push towards these crossbred dairy beef cattle that comes out of these big dairies. There's a big push towards that, because it's one step closer to complete vertical integration, which has always been the end goal for these big corporations, regardless of what industry they're in. It's always about controlling the entire, the entire supply chain and making money off of each part of it. It's cutting out the middlemen and having everything in house. And I don't, I can't say that I'm a fan of it, but it's hard not to be impressed with how it all played together. I mean, how they when they would just flood these eastern cities with dressed beef, and if your butcher over here was running a sale and he you would go undercut him by 5 cents or whatever, and when they lowered their prices you'd lower them again, and it didn't matter if you took a hit. Eventually all those butchers were buying your beef and they worked for you at one of your warehouses. That was another thing that was ingenious with these big three meat packers, is in all the major cities and a lot of the non-major cities they had their warehouses for their chilled beef coming out of Chicago, and then they would break it down into your primal cuts there, and then sell it to your local butcher. And the guy who used to own the butcher shop now was, like a manager or something at your warehouse. And they just they took over more and more sectors of the supply chain, and with all that power, with all that market share comes huge power, and eventually they just, you're able to box out the smaller guy, buy him up, have the guy that used to own the company now run that plant for you, and you pay him a salary. And if they didn't like it, well, you'd find somebody else to do it. And too bad, because you just bought him out, or you drove him into bankruptcy and you buy him for pennies on the dollar. It's a ruthless business, but it's business. It's kind of how it works. And I I don't know. I'm sure there's plenty of things that could have been done over the years to make it a more balanced relationship, but I don't know exactly how that would have, what they would have done. I think maybe that's always how these industries end up, and the hell of it is, people got to eat. So when you have a textile factory that's making kids clothes or something that, well, people don't have the money for, that shuts down. But there's always going to be a demand for meat, and it doesn't matter how tough times are. Like, people are still going to buy beef and pork and chicken. Maybe not as much as they used to, but it's kind of it's one of those industries that no matter how bad it gets, they're always going to be around, and maybe one of them will fail and run themselves in the ground, but they'll just get bought up by another bigger corp, or one of their peers, and you'll have a merger. And it's it's funny how it works, and it all kind of stems back to that too big to fail. Like when you've got enough people with a significant amount of money tied up in you, like you kind of, oops, I lost a bunch of money, but if I go down, so does your bank. So better give me another couple mil. And the rancher typically doesn't have that privilege, that luxury, I would say. Maybe not privilege, luxury. And yeah, this guy was one of the best to do it. Would not recommend this book unless you're just really, really interested in it. But it's called Yankee of the Yards. Kind of a a glowing account. It's written by his son, so it's incredibly biased. But I said it's not a fun read, but it is interesting to kind of get a look into the brain of the guy, and then like you see how well his son thinks of him, and that his son went on to be president for a while of Swift and Company, and I think helped initiate the merger or the buyout. I think Armor bought Swift, but then later on it became Swift again. I don't know. It was I said it was very, very convoluted, kind of an incestuous relationship between these big three. They all owned one another at some point or another, and they I don't know, they figured out how to get to the top, and once they got there, they never really let go. I mean, the names have kind of come and gone a little bit. There's been, one family will kind of fade out and they'll get bought out by another. Swift got bought out by ConAgra, then later by JBS, and then you get Tyson is a new player, makes a big splash in the chicken market, then moves to hogs, and then eventually into beef. And it's always the same game. You make a big splash, you figure out how to do something better than the other guy, and then you just start picking off competitors one at a time, squeezing them out of the market. And the whole time, this process doesn't matter who's running the big packing houses. They're still pressuring the producer to in a way fixing the market, so they keep their high profit margins while the rancher kind of gets pushed out. And there's fluctuations here and there, but those big packers, they don't really ever lose. It seems like they play the game pretty well. I guess I'm not saying I'm a fan of it, but I'm just saying objectively they play the game pretty damn well. And that was the start of it. So but it is, I guess, once again, to reiterate how, I know it was kind of a rambling, hopefully somewhat coherent synopsis, but when you look at it from a 30,000 foot view, and you see what the Packers are doing and how they're squeezing out, they're exerting their power and pressure to lower the cattle prices and hog prices. You can see the same thing happening with coal and steel and railroad. Even with shipping, like actual ships. Lot of weird stuff going on there. When you look at the silver versus gold crisis, I think in 73 was a particularly big one. That's when I want to say, like, all the big railroads failed, essentially. Went into bankruptcy, had to be bailed out because, government created them, and they became kind of essential. So too big to fail. Gotta bail them out. Yeah. So it was the Northern Pacific, Union Pacific, and the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe all failed. And this was 1893. Yeah, 15,000 companies and 500 banks all failed. At the peak, 17 to 19% of the workforce was unemployed. And yeah, when people are unemployed, shit gets shit gets tough real quick when you can't pay your bills. Get kicked out of your house. Either get evicted or foreclosed. Vehicles get repossessed, and they didn't have automobiles at the time, but houses for sure. And and then that leads to bread lines and homeless, and happened 2 times in a 50-year period there after the Civil War. And all the while these big three, I mean, there was a bunch of packing companies that went under during these things, and Swift and Armour and Morris were able to not only stay afloat, but able to acquire a bunch of their competitors and build new branches here and there. Omaha, Fort Worth, Denver, Kansas City. And what was really funny is how some of these cities, like, they laid out the red carpet. They saw how well Chicago was doing with his meatpacking boom, and they created their own stockyards and gave choice real estate to these packing giants. And in some cases, I think Omaha, they even built their packing plants for them, or at least heavily subsidized them. And I mean, it was at the time kind of a win-win deal. But it was it's funny how the thing you want so bad comes back to bite you in the end for a lot of these producers, and it's just funny how these big corporations, these just massive companies, how they work. And the crazy part of it is there's still always like one guy at the top of it, and it's a little more. It was a lot more clear cut back in the day when these fellas were at the top of the game than it is today, where it's a little a lot more convoluted when you get to publicly owned. But these other companies that was another trick they would do. If they ran out of credit somewhere, they would sell more public shares, and that created an influx of cash, and they were able to pay down some of their notes and break ground on a new facility. And it's like I said, it's really quite impressive. They knew how to play the game. They knew how to scratch it out. And the one thing they heavily emphasized with Gustavus Swift in his biography is he always paid his notes on time. There'd be times where he wouldn't make any payments on them, but when the note came due, he always paid it. That's his son saying that, so whether that's true or not, who knows? I would be willing to bet he was very much a Trump-like character, where he would squeeze as much work and goods out of a deal as he could, and then find any way you can to back out of it, whether it's declaring bankruptcy or whatever it is. I bet there was plenty of those type of deals where, yeah, they the contractor or the worker just had to take it on the chin, and there wasn't much you could do about it. And it just so happens that that particular industry is the end point for all these animals that we take care of every day out a horseback. And trying to wrap your head around how all of it works make you go crazy at times. But I do recommend reading into it, and if you realize how the system and the game works, you might have a better shot at being good at it. I don't know. It's also kind of a rigged game too. The house is always against you. So, I'm gonna do some more research, and when I come back for the next episode, we'll talk about how the ranching side of things played into it, and the expansions away from Chicago, and maybe we'll deal with a little bit of the labor unrest and some of the union organization and strikes and riots, and plenty of cool shit to talk about there too. So that's I think that's gonna do it for this one. Hopefully that makes some sense to you. Like I said, it's not my best production by any means, but there was a lot of loose ends to tie up, and there's still a lot more. But I think getting this out here so you kind of know what I'm looking at. Now I think we'll be able to move forward a little bit more coherently. So I apologize for how all over the place and not as detailed as I'd like, but I said I had to clear my head about why all this stuff is so complex, and I haven't even really got into some of the government intervention, aside from the subsidizing new facilities, and even then it's like, if you're Omaha and you're trying to attract people and create jobs there in this new burgeoning city, it makes a lot of sense to roll out the carpet for one of these packing houses. You got a steady supply of cattle, and you got a steady supply of corn. I mean, it makes perfect sense that you might as well have a packing house there too. And you got the railroad there, you got the Missouri River. Like, makes plenty of good sense to why you'd want to have a stockyard and a packing town there. So, some of it makes sense, but as you can see on down the road, it causes a lot of centralization in the market, which is not particularly good for your average producer. So, but also just remember, this was pretty much standard practice throughout that whole period, no matter what industry you're looking at. It was the times, and it's interesting as shit, man. So we'll be back for, I don't forget which is this, part 4. We'll be back for the next episode sometime. I'm not sure when. Got some more reading to do. So hope you guys have a good week, and move your ass. We're burning daylight.
Your eyes up in the morning, beneath the stars so bright. Pull your hat down, make sure your cinch is tight. Horses kinda snuffy, cold chill up your spine. You'll get your ass moving, son, we're burning daylight. Burning daylight. Burning daylight. In the saddle till the job's done right. Just together, and you won't catch 'em all. But when you ride through the gate, make sure you sit up tall. I can see the horizon, it's looking pretty bright. Well, get your ass moving, son, we're burning daylight.